We're gonna start, and while we start, then we'll get some people coming by the phone line and everything. Welcome again. This is the January Policy Speaker Series from the NASA Carbon Research Program. I would like to welcome today's speakers, Charles Murphy. He's the head of operations for the TreeBaltimore Partnership, and Nathan Randolph is a GIS specialist for the city of Baltimore. They both work with the Baltimore City Department of Recreation and Parks. And they're going to be presenting on the Tree Baltimore Partnership on increasing tree canopy at the city level. We're going to leave the questions for the end of the presentation, if that's okay. So now, without further ado, I leave you with Charles and Nathan.
Okay, as Idol said, my name is Charles. Most people call me Charlie. And I've been working with the Tree Baltimore program for 9 years now as part of the city government. So Tree Baltimore was originally started as a mayoral initiative in the notion of trying to increase the canopy in Baltimore City. As was said earlier, we're part of Recreation and Parks, the Urban Forestry Division. And it's kind of evolved into this partnership. So originally, and some people still say Tree Baltimore is a program, and it is a city program, but really the way it has kind of evolved is become kind of this partnership through the federal, the state, and local government agencies, nonprofits and for-profits, as well as individual citizens or friends of groups for parks or neighborhood associations. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about how it evolved. I got on. So I love this slide, and I was just talking to Nathan earlier. It really needs a little bit of updating. But really, the main thing about Tree Baltimore is, again, it is a partnership. It is a combination of folks, whether it is an energy company that gives us grant funding, the Forest Service who helps us with doing some of our data analysis, multiple nonprofits that work either city level or in specific neighborhoods around town, as well as individuals. And all these different groups have the little niche areas of targeting. So for example, this is Blue Water Baltimore, whose main focus is the water quality in Baltimore. Baltimore Green Space targets something known as forest patches, which is actually 20% of the tree canopy in Baltimore. And those are on areas like vacant lots or privately owned properties that host a decent sized plot of forested area with the goal of protecting it. So tree planting to leadership. So the Tree Baltimore program initially was conceived in 2006, 2007 timeframe, and the first 2 years were used to kind of create a strategy plan for how we were going to go about increasing the tree canopy in Baltimore. But at this point, and when that first started in 2009, where we got on the ground, on the boots, we were out there, we were leading tree plantings, we were working with neighborhood associations to really plan out where we were planting at schools, in parks, and really actually getting out there and leading the plantings. At this point, we may assist with lead on maybe 1 or 2 plantings a season, but there's really like 40 or 50 plantings a season going on. So we really took a step back into a leadership role of providing the resources for some of those nonprofits I mentioned previously and let them do the leadership on the ground work. So they're the ones meeting with the neighborhood associations. They're the ones setting up the tree planting plans, and then they're sending them to us for approval, but we're not actually working that out. So the original goal was 40% tree canopy. At that point in time in 2007, our tree canopy was 20%. So the idea was doubling it. Whether or not that was a political mind stake in the fact that O'Malley was our mayor and heading to run for governor against the gentleman, I believe, from Prince George's County, who had 38% and said they're going to make 40% tree canopy. So O'Malley wanted to match that, not realizing that 20% tree canopy is a crazy thing to think about doubling. And we set a time frame for 2037. One of the goals that was not really discussed and is not really politicized is the notion of not only increasing tree canopy, but improving the health of the tree canopy. There's a continual challenge of invasives, destruction and just overall poor health in some of our canopy that we've been working on with new programs to kind of improve over the years. And this is an excellent graphic of showing to achieve UTC goal, it's not just planting, but it's looking at the existing UTC, the growth and protecting of the canopy we currently have, and then realizing that we will have mortality and loss. So the canopy goals, I kind of mentioned 20 to 40% by 2037. In 2011, we got new data that said that we were at 27%, and everyone got super excited. This is great. We've already increased 7%. This is going to be really easy. That was simply due to better data and being able to analyze tree canopy and realizing that not all the tree canopy there's a ton of tree canopy that was not collected at 20% because the resolution got way better. So to realize that, we just got our new data set analyzed by Jarlath Dunn O'Neill up at Vermont, and we are at 28% in 2018. This is huge because we are the only city that the Forest Service has done this analysis for that actually increase in canopy. So DC is stating, and the KC Tree is stating they are increasing canopy, and that's great. That was done by a private analysis. When the Forest Service did the analysis for DC, they showed no gain. And so to the point that, actually let's go back real quick. When this analysis is done off of 2015 data, and it was analyzed 3 times from start because Jarlath could not believe that we actually went up in canopy. So he literally took people and made them go over the data from start 3 times to be positive that we actually increased and had a net increase in canopy. And I won't go into the percentages of why it should look better than this, but Jarlath gets real angry that we shouldn't go past the decimal of the percentage because it's scientifically not, you shouldn't. So I don't do that for him. So the big thing with the goals and realizing this is that we should be planting 25 to 30,000 trees a year to hit this goal of 40% by 2037, and we're currently only planting anywhere from 8 to 10,000, and that's tied to several reasons. That's funding, that's having available planting spaces. It's one of those things that when we first started, we were planting these large open parks, as you can see in that one picture, where you could plant hundreds of trees in an afternoon with volunteers. And now we've had to focus because we've kind of saturated those open areas, and we've had to change our attack into street trees, which is you're planting larger B&B 2.5-inch caliper trees. You're going to have to open up concrete to plant these trees in tree pits. And so you're looking at planting 30 to 40 trees in an afternoon with volunteers, plus a week's worth of prep time to open up those pits, which becomes much more cost crucial, and it also takes up a bunch more time. Plus, you're planting in front of people's houses, and I don't know if any of you guys have ever dealt with urban tree planting. That can cause some issues. So UTC, obviously, the urban tree canopy, and you're working with the Forest Service, and obviously this is New York, but just showing you an example of how we're taking the data, and as we were talking earlier, that's presumably coming from NASA and being utilized and analyzed by the Forest Service so that we can use it as an end user to help target what we're doing on the ground. So as I said, in 2017, we had the new data handed off to us at the very end, and they were overlaying data from 07 and 15 to see that loss and gain to really come up with that 1% increase. So there was definitely large areas, specific neighborhoods where development was happening and other issues where there was massive loss. So there will be neighborhoods in Baltimore where there probably is like a 10% decrease in canopy, and then there's other areas where you may have a larger or a decrease versus an increase. And it's very interesting to watch, but it's also one of those things that we can use that to start targeting specific neighborhoods. So if we know that like a neighborhood just lost a large percentage of canopy because of a development, presumably we're hoping that the neighbors are angry that all these trees came down, so let's target some giveaways. Let's give some private property trees away to the neighborhood, right? Let's target that neighborhood for street tree planting. Let's target it for giveaways and try to increase that, or try to offset the decrease that happened. We're still working with the Forest Service to get better analysis as far as down to those specific neighborhood levels, specific project levels of loss. But again, at this point, we're really excited that we actually saw an overall increase, and we're really just, again, trying to work forward this notion of how to target or use this data to target different neighborhoods in areas of Baltimore. So, one of the first, so this is based off of that '07 data. The green is obviously the tree canopy. And one of the big things that we utilized the UTC data for was creating this prioritization map. And I'm going to get into a little bit of what exactly this prioritization map means. But really, the main purpose of it was to get buy-in and have folks speak out on why they wanted to plant trees, so that it wasn't just a bunch of forestry folks sitting in a room going, you know what, we have low canopy here, let's plant there, right? Let's green the map. Obviously, that's our end goal, but let's start to prioritize that, and let's let everyone get a kind of their own say or feed into the machine, essentially. So what we did with prioritization planting map was create, with the Forest Service help, kind of major criteria of why people may potentially plant trees, and tie that to specific data, whether that's tied to census data or just our local health department data. We really kind of worked to find any data set, if it was at a neighborhood level, a block level, an address level, a zip code level, to figure out any data set that we could collect and then use that to tie back to why people plant. And we essentially had a stakeholders meeting of about almost 30 groups. So we're talking the Department of Health for the city of Baltimore. We're talking about local nonprofits. We're talking about the Department of Transportation, the mayor's office, really anyone that's engaged. We had down to like the Friends of Gwynns Falls Leakin Park. We had a couple of neighborhood associations. We really opened it up to anyone that wanted to partake. And basically you got 10 points and you put in how important these different criteria were to you and the reasons that we should plant trees. And based off of, like I said, that's those data sets that we cross-reference into neighborhood block levels, we could create, and we collected, as you can see, all these different total points. So it looks like we had 25 groups if the total is 250. But we could, again, see why people were planting, cross-reference that with different data sets like heat island, as well as stormwater and things like that, like impervious levels. And you can see all the different criteria levels that were, or variables that were tied to. And really, it gave us a better picture of why people wanted to plant, as well as allowing us to create that priority map that we can then use for targeting planting. So obviously we can't just stop planting in areas throughout the city because we are a city program and everyone that pays taxes is paying into our program. But when we look at the types of plantings we're doing, the larger scale targeted plantings, neighborhood-wide, whether it's street tree plantings or large park plantings and school plantings, we're really trying to focus in on these orange and red areas. And you can kind of see it kind of forms that circle around the inner harbor. I will point out this one that's very large in red that has not been targeted is private industrial. So we're still working on figuring out how to program ourselves into being able to get in there. There's a lot of impervious surface. We would love to remove a lot of those parking lots from old industry that aren't even used. They're basically empty, but that's one of those things that we've been working on, figuring out how to get in there and open the door for those conversations. But as you can see, we've done a decent job of kind of targeting those priority areas. And we are working on an updated version of this map. We just have to then go through what new data sets exist, who has those data sets, how do we get those engaged, and then come back to our stakeholders and open it up for another round of these kind of questions and answerings and getting this data set targeted. This is just another example of plantings of larger scale. You can see a lot of them are focused in that red to orange area. But we also, again, have it spread out. And I'll talk about a little bit about what some of these outer layers in the green area exist from. So when I came on board in 2009, the plan had just been finished. It was handed to me. They said, digest this and figure out what our first steps are. At the same time in 2009 is when we were getting that data set that said we had 27% from the Forest Service. And so this is one of the charts that came out of that 27% canopy. And two things to take very important note of is the bright green is grass, meaning easy to plant, it's open space, it's not like you have to remove the impervious surface, which is in yellow, and or the green that is already the trees. If you look at the three largest bright green, two of them are on residential areas, so it's private property. I'm a city program, so I flipped through the plan. Well, how do we target private property? Nothing in it. So, starting from scratch, we started to work on a program for giving away trees for private property. We can't really expend a ton of resources and money to plant on private property, especially because once we do something, if you allow us on to plant a tree, we don't necessarily have that right to come back and make sure that you're watering it, caring for it. And so to drop a lot of resources on a one-time thing and not be able to check up on it becomes very nerve-wracking for us. So what we started to do was our giveaway program was tied to coming out to farmers markets, going into neighborhood association meetings, and coming with little 1 to 3 gallon potted trees that not the ones you get from Arbor Day that come in the mail that are little twigs like this, but bigger twigs that are about two or so feet tall. With a wide range of species, and just kind of starting the dialogue of this notion that you can get free trees for your yard through this program. And so we've kind of expanded that. So when you saw some of those outliers in the green areas, it's not necessarily that we went into those neighborhoods to plant. It could have been that we did a giveaway and those folks were at that farmer's market and took away free trees and planted them in their yards, which is great. But it's not like we are targeting large-scale projects or plantings in those neighborhoods because they just aren't high priority at this point. And obviously the other one is parks. We have, again, planted out for the most part our large parks and some of our smaller ones. That grass area includes baseball fields, football fields, soccer fields. So until Rex says I can put a tree in the middle of their field, we kind of have to leave some of that grass, which is perfectly okay. We're happy to accommodate. But again, it's just one of those things we're looking at. And you can see the very far one is private or institutional facilities. Again, that's how we're trying to work to get our foot in the door for some of these industrial areas that have these large footprints that we could hopefully plant. So I just talked about the giveaway program. Tree Neighborhood is another similar private property giveaway program, which is tied to not just going and coming to a table where you can get a tree, but really working with your neighborhood and your neighbors to fill out a form and say, hey, I've got 10 neighbors, we all want a tree or two, and we'll actually drop off like 5 gallon, which is a tree that's probably about 5 to 7 foot tall. And we'll drop off a bunch of those into your neighborhood at a specific location. Everyone can come pick them up on a given day. But just another way to, again, try to target private property with some larger trees, minimizing the effort of the notion of us having to do the outreach as well as the planting and the follow-up maintenance, which is always going to kind of be a problem. We are still taking part, again, in these large-scale tree plantings, whether on parks or on streets. But again, really allowing the leadership role to fall on the actual nonprofits that are doing the community outreach, that are doing the planning and the volunteer coordination, and then we kind of provide the trees. We show up on the day of to assist, but we're not really that face. We're not on the ground face of people, what people are looking at. So we, again, try and continually push that out. This is always a silly picture. This gentleman here is Ted. He also works at TreeBaltimore. We participate in a lot of different events, just trying to get our name out there and let people know that we exist and what we are here to offer. And this was part of, we were part of the rally for like clean water and swimmable water in the harbor. Oh, it's called Flotilla. I don't know if you guys have that in DC or not, but literally just hundreds of people in kayaks, stand-up paddle boards, canoes, just pushing the notion that we want clean water. And we came and tried to give trees away from out of a canoe. It was interesting. But we got in the local newspaper because someone took a picture and then had to come and ask, like, what is this about? Why are there trees in your canoe? So it worked, I guess, to some degree. We work with fruit trees and tying that into health and healthy eating. So we work with the health department on that and working with a couple of nonprofits like the Baltimore Orchard Project. Again, they're kind of the face and the lead of that. We just provide them with the resource of the trees and anything else they might need. Education is a huge one. We lead a lot of workshops. So we have something called Tree Keepers, which is kind of what Casey Tree has in DC as far as training folks to become certified tree planting and pruning experts within the city to kind of help us with leading different events. We also have a Weed Warriors program, which ties back into that, not just planting, but taking care of the forests that we currently have. And that's our invasive management training. So that's certifying folks to understand what the top 12 invasives are in the area, how to remove them, when to remove them, how to coordinate with local folks to really get them out. So it's not just you in your local park removing them or your local little forest patch removing them, but actually a larger scale events. Engagement, again, that is coming to any event humanly possible to kind of get our name and our face out there and get people involved. For example, one of the engagement pieces happening later tonight, we will be at what are we even calling it? It's a town hall gathering sort of thing for a granite pipeline from BG&E that's cutting through one of our parks, and it's just to inform and engage folks. Unfortunately, it's happening. It's not much that we can do about it at this point, but it's informing folks that it's happening and how can we on the back end kind of fix it and repair it, and start with that notion of we're going to come and train and teach you guys how to replant and fill in these areas. We're going to teach you guys how to keep the invasives out of this new hole that's basically you can cut through your park as well. And promoting advocacy so that things like this don't happen so that we can kind of get the ball rolling. Again, we are a city agency, so it's pretty tough for us to tell folks, hey, this is bad, go stop this. We can't really do that, but the notion is through the education and through our workshops, kind of building up these folks that are fostering this education and care for the environment, and so that when things like this come through the pipeline and people are listening and hearing about it, that they start to rally and try to prevent some of these problems from happening. This is going to be kind of the transition slide from me into Nathan. These are some other, so again, TreeBaltimore is the community forestry portion of forestry. And we really engage in the notion of tree planting, working with our nonprofit and city partners to really get the trees in the hands of the folks that are planting. We also go after a ton of different grants and different funding to help fund all this stuff that we're doing. But within forestry, we have a bunch of other stuff that's happening. So for example, we just got our first forest management plan done for a very large section of forested area. In fact, I think the second largest urban forest area in this side of the Mississippi, I think. And it's really fascinating. It's trying to figure out how to deal with deer, the invasive problem, things like the pipeline going through. That's actually the park that the pipeline's going through. So it's great that we got this management plan in time to kind of figure out how to combat that. But it's how we aren't just looking at street trees as the way that we should be looking at urban forests, but also the actual forest that exists within the urban environment. Camp Small is our zero waste facility. So previously, any tree that came down in Baltimore City was removed by forestry or a forestry contractor and just dumped at a site called Camp Small. And when we overfilled that site, we had to pay another contractor to come and remove said waste. Seems ridiculous. So we have somebody that has the greatest job title ever. He's the yard master at Camp Small. And he has been working on actually salvaging logs, so making sure that when they're removing trees, they're not cutting logs into like 6-foot sections that are unusable for lumber or anything like that. It's looking at creating long slices or long logs that we can mill, looking for trees that might be unique to artisans like bowl makers and things like that. Figuring out which trees could be just kind of junk and we can use them for firewood for folks to come and buy. But really just kind of diversifying what we're doing with the wood. And at the end of the day, anything that's really kind of left over gets mulched up. We let it sit and age, and then we actually use that in our program to deliver for tree planting. So again, it's one of those things, instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every couple of years to remove this stuff, we're now investing less than $100,000 a year to literally run that operation and reutilize some of that stuff. And the goal is to actually get to a point where we're breaking even. So the selling of the lumber, the selling of mulch and soil and things like that we have on site can actually start to even out the cost of running the facility. And we're getting there. I don't think we're at the break-even point, but we're getting close to that.
Don't you want to leave some of the trees there too, Derek, so they don't break down?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So on site, we will mulch a large portion, and some of that we will leave as wood chips that we use.
Snags, you leave the snags.
Oh, we do in forested areas, so the forest management plan and some of those large forested areas, absolutely. On the street, no. Can't really leave the snags. In fact, we're dealing with that right now where we've limbed up trees and have to cut down the snags.
Are you using native trees as well? Native trees?
Yeah,
Ecotypes? What about
absolutely. So every tree that we purchase and provide for planting within the city that is going into a park or a school property is native. We try to stay as native on the street as possible, but at a point you can only plant so many red buds and service berries under wires until you got to switch it up into some plums and cherries and things like that. So on street trees we will go a little bit non-native, but we're still at like a 70-30 split of native versus non-native. But on parkland and school lands and any open space, we try to stay we're at like a 90-95% native rate. Yeah, we're trying to stay as native as humanly possible.
What's the non-native ones? Are they?
So on the street, I mean, we get anything from things like ginkgos to some. One of the main things that we look for, especially in Baltimore, we have a lot of narrow streets. So any like columnar trees, so like some English oaks or some hybrid English American oaks and things like that are very common.
Pears or anything?
Oh, no. So, all right, really sad quick story. The actual tree of Baltimore City, as proclaimed by Donald Schaefer when he was mayor, is the Bradford pear, and no one has actually changed it yet. So we're working on it. We just got to get the mayor's ear to actually want to change that. We're trying to get that done actually for hopefully this Arbor Day, a new tree that's not a Bradford pear. But yeah, so in the 60s and 70s, we do have a couple of neighborhoods that have all these old, really aging Bradford pears that probably should have died about 10 years ago. So anytime there's a snowstorm, you can't even plow the street because there's just too many branches in the way. But yeah, no, we're very much on top of, in the last 10 years have just been like we stopped planting fringe tree for the last 3 or 4 years because we were afraid of what the next point is, the emerald ash borer. We heard a couple of reports, immediately we took it off our planting list. We were like, we're not planting it. It just came back this year because we got a report saying it was okay, but we were very much on top of any tree that's gonna cause problems and things like that. It's hard selling that to folks, so when you go out and you're planting in front of people's houses and they're like, it's gonna get into my roots, it's gonna break up my sidewalk, it's this, that, or the other, and it's like, it's hard to argue with what the past has provided you, but we try to explain to them urban forestry is a relatively new study. It is a new practice, so knowing that we don't plant in 4x4 pits anymore. Our minimum is 4x8. It's knowing that we're not going to plant a large oak tree in front of a house that is super compacted. Like it's informing them that, yeah, that did happen, and we're working on planting appropriate species in appropriate locations so that those types of things don't happen anymore.
Charles,
Yep.
for our online speakers, could you please repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, sure. The original question was talking natives versus non-natives in planting, and I just kind of went into why we plant natives. Yeah. So the next one is the emerald ash borer plan. Our largest percent of an individual species is the emerald or is the ash. Unfortunately, luckily, a large percentage of them are in our forested areas. So as they die, they become snags. Unfortunately, with ash, they are very splintery and can drop very quickly. So we are on a plan to remove over 5 years the 5,000 that are in the developed parkland and on the streets. And we're treating about 400 of the 25-inch or greater mature, healthy ones at this point. But I think even then, we just did our second. You have to treat every 2 years. We just did our second treatment this past spring, and I think we had still seen, even with the treatment, a loss of a couple of them. So we'll see how long that goes. But with the removal of the 5,000, we got funding to not only do the removals, but also replant with a native that obviously won't be attacked by the emerald ash borer. So that's one of our major plans that we're working on. The other one is proactive pruning. So again, this ties back to how do you increase your urban tree canopy? And it might sound a little crazy to prune a tree to make your canopy grow. But it's one of those things that forestry has really been focused only continually because of budget cuts of being retroactive. So a complaint comes in that this tree is dead or it's dropping branches, and then we go out and remove it or prune it. The notion of proactive pruning is completely the brainchild of the city arborist, my boss, Eric Deal, who basically was like, give me a small pot of money and I will show that we will get less SRs after heavy storms in neighborhoods that I have proactively pruned. And so they gave him a small pot of money, and the amount of calls dropped like 60% after a major storm in the 2 neighborhoods that we proactively pruned. And so they go, okay, well, here's a much larger pot of money, start doing that. Because when a storm happens, you're paying overtime, you're paying crazy money because it's one of those things you're working around the clock to clear streets and things like that. And if with a little bit of upfront money, you can actually prevent that from happening. So we've been working on that. Unfortunately, Baltimore, I think, has like 280 neighborhoods, and we currently have funding to do maybe like 15 to 20 a year. So we're trying to rotate it as quickly as possible throughout the neighborhood or throughout the city. And the last thing is the tree inventory, which I'm actually going to hand off to Nathan, who's going to give you a much better informed discussion about it because he actually leads and runs that program.
Yeah, as Charlie said, my name's Nathan Randolph. I'm the GIS specialist with Baltimore City Recreation and Parks in the Forestry Division, more specifically. So it's been an exciting year as far as data goes for the city of Baltimore. We got our tree canopy layer in 2017, and now we're acquiring our first ever full street tree inventory. So it started in April of last year, April 2017. We're collecting data on street trees and potential planting sites, as well as vacant planting sites throughout the entire city, in the street right-of-way, as well as in maintained areas of city parks. We decided to collect during the leaf-on season only for data consistency, as far as assessing the health of the canopy of the tree. We just decided that would be best for us. And we're anticipating that the entire city should be inventoried this fall. This is a look at the data that we're collecting for each site. I'll say that it's one data set for planting sites as well as trees, and the status changes from planting site to tree as trees are removed and planted, so on and so forth. On the left is some of the location data we record, very basic. Some to be more specific would be space type, tree, lawn, median, planter, pit, that sort of thing. So we know what type of space we're dealing with, potentially what type of tree we'd plant in that location. Hardscape, be like bricks over top of the roots of the tree, which you'll see in the city sometimes, or tree grates, the metal. Space length and width, which plays a role in what type of tree we plant, as well as how many trees we can plant at that location. And overhead utilities, that's a huge one for us because we don't want to plant a tall growing tree that's going to grow into the power lines and need to be cut down to either cut down or pruned extensively. As far as tree data goes, we get the diameter, DBH, estimated height, number of stems, condition of the tree, recommended maintenance, and then general observations. So far this year, we've collected data for approximately 50% of the city. The map on the right, it's kind of hard to see, what's what, but it really doesn't matter. I just kind of wanted to throw this one up there so that you could see how much of the city was done and where the data has been collected. And so far, between April and October, our contractor collected data on over 69,000 trees, almost 3,000 stumps, over 22,000 vacant sites. Vacant sites are ones that are ready to plant. And that's where this ties into the tree canopy, because we'll be able to tell where we can plant trees. And then also vacant potential sites, which is where tree pits can be cut. So we have a lot of pavement, especially downtown, and we can open that up and plant trees there as well. And so they're identifying these locations where so how do we use this data? There's two main things we use this data for. One huge one is maintenance. It helps us to determine what our maintenance needs are. And the data we use from the inventory for that are maintenance needs. So they recommend maintenance. These are certified arborists out there collecting this data. So we have an idea of what maintenance needs are for each tree. The condition, is it poor? Does it need to be removed? Is it dead? Or is it in good condition? DBH, size of the tree, we use that for multiple things, but also for maintenance. Overhead utilities again for work and the hardscape. And then for planting, so for tree planting, we use all of this data to assist in planning of tree planting. We can combine this with the tree canopy data. So vacant and potential site information is obviously useful. We can create heat maps like the one you see on the right with that information that show point density of vacant sites. Space type, so whether it's open space to plant in, if it's a pit, a planter. Species composition, so that we can increase the diversity of that area, because it may be a monoculture. The whole street could be planted with zelkovas or, maybe red maples, which is the highest number in the city. And then utilities, again, we don't want to plant a tall growing tree under utilities. So jumping right into thoughts for the future as far as what we can do with this data and tying it to the tree canopy data. I have done work with the tree canopy data and doing the analysis. It would be great if we could have data acquisition more frequently as far as assessing our tree canopy and potentially loss after storms, for example. Also, I've played around a bit with using LiDAR for QA/QC on our tree inventory data. So presence, absence, potentially height. For quality control on the data. It seems to be pretty accurate for that. And then for, multispectral imagery, using the tree inventory as a control, potentially for getting samples for the infrared imagery, getting spectral signatures, potentially isolating tree crowns, individual species even. Just some wild ideas that popped into my head. But, and then basically just tying all this data together.
Do you guys have a revisit plan for that inventory?
Well, that might be hostile. So we've been discussing it. I think we're looking at two different potentials. So we actually have forestry inspectors. We have six forestry inspectors that have their own districts. And so we're playing around with the notion of whether or not they can just, instead of following up on SRs or requests and dealing with calls coming in, instead of that, actually treating it as this notion of just re-updating the inventory data and just starting. So it's almost like that notion of painting the bridge and through 7 years, getting through the entire bridge and then restarting, just continually collecting data. That's one possibility we've been looking at. And I think that's kind of how DC operates, in the notion that their inspectors literally, unless there's an emergency, are going out and recollecting data from the original inventory. So that's one thing. The other option is just trying to find funding to redo it every 5 to 7 years, which would actually be much cheaper because we already have the baseline data that they would be using. So that's also another possibility. You just have to find the funding for that.
So it sounds like you're basically manually collecting this data one tree at a time, walking the street. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We aren't. Yeah.
I was wondering if there would be any potential in doing, Google car drive-by mapping sort of technology.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So the question was, if we're manually collecting each tree data point in the inventory, and so it's Davy. Our contractor is Davy Trees, and they are manually collecting. So I think because the goal is to use the data points for actual management, we want to be pretty accurate. And so the notion being that if you aren't getting out of your car and checking to see if there's decay on the backside of a tree, and we've been told by an expert that that tree was healthy, and then that tree falls and it's a liability, we can fall into some problems. We have done that, what you just described, of the notion of using like Google Streets for, and we still currently do it because we haven't completed the inventory, for finding potential locations for planting. So we have a bunch of different funding sources right now where we're contractually planting a bunch of trees, and in areas where the inventory has not been completed to give us those potential planting sites, we literally have folks on the computer just going down the street going like, I think we can get a pit there. And then of course we go and ground truth it. But yeah, it gives us that start of where we're going out to check to make sure, instead of just walking up and down the streets. But yeah.
Second question. And you pointed out the large location there in southeast Baltimore that's basically old industrial.
Mhm.
And somewhere down there, I think Under Armour is going to do a new facility. You guys working with these new developments, industrial, commercial developments for tree purposes?
So we have not worked with Under Armour per se. So yeah, so Under Armour is actually going to be working right here. They actually, I think, are taking off this section here, this bottom. So I mean, you can kind of see where all these things are popping out. These are all ports. So Baltimore is a major port city. These are actually like little fishing docks, so that's not port area. So the problem is, again, the issue is it's a lot of impervious. So like you think of a dock and piers coming in or whatever, but they're unloading massive shipment containers that then are being put on 18-wheelers that need space to turn around, this, that, or the other. The next thing you know, there's no space for any of these folks to handle that. That being said, we do have MS4 and WIP permits tied to like the Chesapeake Bay, where the ports cannot meet them on site. So they are now finding some of our local nonprofit partners to pay them to find spaces to start doing some of these plantings or bioswells or any type of other water management practices. But yeah, so as far as Under Armour is concerned, I've seen initial ideas for plans, but we're not anywhere close where they're gonna have it, but I'm sure at some point that stuff will come across our desk for approval. I think did you have another question, or?
Just kind of related to what he was asking, I was wondering if you had considered crowdsourcing some of this, or having people either adopt a tree or volunteer a site, like for the city to come plant.
You mean as far as at the industrial levels, or or just so a lot of our plantings, when they're like street tree level, a lot of our nonprofit partners are working for community engagement. So it will be the community that comes out and helps plant. You may get like a group from Constellation or BG&E or some energy company or Comcast Cares Day or whatever, where we get a big swell of volunteers for the day of. But in the greening community, we're very aware that that's 3 hours in the life of a tree. So when you're doing street tree plantings, you're going door to door, you're meeting with the neighborhood associations, you're trying to plan out, okay, we're here, we're going to be watering for 2 years to make sure this tree gets rooted in. But after that establishment period, you're going to have to look out because it's in front of your house, and I'm not going to drive by this tree every day. So if something starts happening or it needs a pruning or whatever, it's working with those folks to really kind of become engaged and steward those areas. So on.
Talking more about like the inventory.
Oh, the inventory. So Casey did that originally before the DC paid to have their inventory done, and I think it was actually almost as expensive, if not more expensive, because of the staff time it takes to train folks to actually do the data collection, and because again we're going back to that notion of liability with we're using it as management, it became a time money thing where we just felt that the notion of actually paying a contractor to do it made the most sense. But yeah, we definitely looked into that. We actually met with Philly, DC, and and I think New York to talk about how they did their different inventories. It's possible that for updating the inventory, because species is one of the main things that could be wrong, we may use potentially crowdsourcing for like the next reiteration of it.
It could be a different level of quality.
Yeah, so we've had neighborhood groups that have done smaller scale their neighborhood data, and then of course they were like, well, use our data, you don't have to come into our neighborhood. And it's like, we appreciate your data, and we do use it. We use it for things like targeting planting. So we can use it to say, okay, well, there's all these empty pits. Well, we know that because of that inventory, and we use that, and that type of scope. The notion being, though, we have the problem of if it's for collecting data for the trees and we're using that as management, we want to make sure that we have some sort of tree expert. And correct me if I'm wrong, every person collecting data is at least a certified arborist?
Right, and that's another reason we went with a contractor is for consistency of data and having certified arborists collect the data.
Yeah. Question, and then I come to you. Yeah.
So there are various wild areas along 83, Druid Hill Park.
Mhm.
I bicycle the Jones Falls Trail
Sure.
every day. And those trees are being overrun by vines. So are there any plans on what to do about?
Yeah, so I touched on it very briefly. I can get a little bit more into detail. So we have what's called our Weed Warriors program, and it actually has 2 people currently on staff, and we're working on getting an actual crew together. So one of the people on staff is a crew leader, and the goal is right now to create an invasive vegetation management plan for the entire city and use that to target specific areas like along the trails, or any large areas of edge like 83, and have the other person who's a crew leader really kind of take those crews and start targeting those areas. And that's where things like the management plan that I brought up are huge, because then instead of just going like, well, go target the side of 83, you can go to this management plan where someone put together this idea of, okay, well, you should target here, here, and here first, because you want to work on areas that are least invasive to move out and protect versus going from like say a 5-level invasive and moving down, or they could say the other way around. It really dependent. Like I said, we're trying to get management plans for along the Jones Falls at like Silburn, as well as Druid Hill, Clifton, and Herring Run, I think. So the 5 major parks that have forested areas, we're trying to get management plans for them as well, so that as this crew comes on board, we can start to attack some of those things.
And those would be city employee crew, or they could be?
Yeah, there would be a city. At this point, we're looking to get a city crew to be doing that kind of work. But we also have, again, we have nonprofits that are doing similar work, but again, it's more of like a one-time, a Comcast Cares Day where 300 people come out, and we have folks at the nonprofits that are trained to be able to lead those types of people, and we'll chip in and help, because 300 people is a crazy amount of people to have handing loppers and hand pruners to, and just say go take care of those vines. But yeah, so those are one-off days, so we're trying to figure out how to get crews that can continually come back and manage these types of things, because it's not a one-time take care of the vine kind of thing.
So we actually have a couple of questions, if you
Okay.
can hold your thought. One of them was about removal of ash trees.
Mhm.
So are they taking ash that are not infected too? Is there any research that shows if any ash are immune mindful of what happened with chestnuts, taking all of them, even though some were likely immune?
So we are not. We are. So when we went through, so unfortunately, again, this is where inventory would have been very nice a couple of years ago. We literally had to do a windshield survey of where all our ash were within the city. And so when we were doing that, we were looking at the size as well as the health at that point, and I think we scaled it 1 to 5. Something along those lines. And so as we're doing the removals, we're starting at the 5s, the worst ones, and removing those. So the notion being is if some of these ones that are healthy and are immune, it's possible that at year 5, if they still haven't been affected, we may leave them. But at this point, it was one of the things that we were being told that 97% of them are dead. And again, so the thing is we are leaving ash trees in the forested areas. So if some of those survive and are immune, then we can look at those in the future. But we are looking to remove anything where people can get hurt when it starts to decay, and we couldn't risk that at the street level.
We also had a question from Donna Lee. She is looking to develop a greenhouse gas initiative for her country for trees and forests at the local level. And so she's wondering, is this effort connecting to Baltimore's climate action plan, including using it to develop a greenhouse gas inventory for urban forests or trees? And it seems Baltimore's greenhouse gas inventory does not include forests or trees, but this could provide the data needed.
So I know the person who worked at sustainability and wrote the climate action plan. I think we wrote a small piece for that plan. But yeah, as far as the sequestration of that kind of stuff, I don't know that we are being looked at as that. So no, that's something that we should probably look into a little bit more. We work pretty closely with sustainability, and I know the climate action plan only came out in, I think, 2016. So I would imagine when their next report comes in a couple of years, they'll be asking us, what did you do? So how can we record this kind of thing? And we are working, I know one of the things we have Nancy Santi from the Forest Service, who's actually been working with a couple of researchers to take samples out of stumps after a tree's been removed to do, I think, checking some carbon sequestration at the urban level, dependent on different species. So that's one of those things that's kind of going on, and hopefully when that comes out, we can possibly tie those things together.
Okay, and we also have a question from Zoe Johnson. I would like to ask a question about long-term monitoring of trees planted through your programs and whether data is being collected that would help gain a better understanding of how extreme events, heat, drought, intense storms may be impacting certain species or location of planting. Also, I'm wondering if future climate conditions are something that is considered in terms of selection of species.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, so it ties into several different things. So survivability. So again, the notion of collecting accurate data when the trees are going in is huge. And that's where Nathan has been crucial in setting up how our nonprofits and our different partners as trees are going in are collecting that data so that we can, one, add it to the inventory, and two, go back and check survivability. As far as comparing that to like larger scale things like climate change and storm damage, I mean, that's something we'll be able to do in the future. We haven't done it yet. We did work with the University of Michigan, and they were trying to create a model so that we could see the changes of zones as climate change is affecting us and what species may be doing better here. But we also have a gentleman in our office who loves to say, it's not that as the zones change, it's not that the species are migrating. It's the notion that actually they're mostly shrinking. So just because something that does well in the south, it's warmer here now, doesn't mean that they can handle the winter. So literally the freezing cold week we had in January could potentially kill a tree that would do well from now through next January, but a weak cold snap could potentially kill it. So it's looking at it at a long scale. We're working with, like I said, the University of Michigan and different researchers to figure that out, but we are taking that into consideration. I know 3 or 4 years ago, we entered into planting not just northern red oak, but also southern red oak, which is, I think, like, okay, well, I guess this is where we're headed. But again, that just started a couple of years ago. So seeing how well the southern red oak survives versus the northern red oak is something that we're going to have to see as years progress.
Yeah, well, my question is basically the last two questions. Do you have the fraction of phenological type of the trees that you are planting in terms of like broadleaf versus needleleaf and deciduous versus evergreen? And this is my first question. And that question ultimately leads me to the impact of your noble, I'll say, action of planting trees. One of them would be the carbon sequestration and air purification.
Yep.
Second is impact on storms.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that is most common is the urban heat islands, the heating
Sure.
within the city.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one again, real quick, was.
It's like which phenological type are you preferring?
Oh, sure.
You said
Okay.
This is native,
So
but
yeah.
you didn't say which
So
one.
it's a wide variety. Our tree order list is of line items is like 540 different line items. Now it's not 540 different species because we have to order them in different sizes, but I would wager it's like 160 different types of species, if not more, that we're ordering. So it is anything and everything. And so when we're planting and we're collecting down to species and cultivar, so we can divide that kind of stuff out if it's needed or questioned. Yeah. As far as its effects on carbon sequestration, like I said, Nancy from the Forest Service is working on that study to see what at the urban level is there change from what they're finding in, say, a forested area. And you said carbon sequestration. What was some of the other ones?
Impact of severe storms.
Oh, it was storms
flooding.
and heat islands. So, so storms again, because most of the stuff we're planting is relatively 2.5 inch caliper. We haven't seen much on that. With the heat island, we have.
But are you
I think
taking
it's.
those as targets for your.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Do you have some numbers? Are you limiting the urban heat island by some degrees by the end of your program?
So we don't have goals or targets to that, but we are working with the Office of Sustainability that does have goals. So they have set goals through like the Climate Action Plan and Sustainability Plan, and they have a bunch of different ways to do that. And trees is just literally just a sentence in that. So no, our program at TreeBaltimore is not looking at that as a specific goal. We understand and we do appreciate the fact that it is end goal, so we do try to plant or an end product. So we are looking at, when we try to go out and sell people on trees, it's take a canopy tree, take a big oak, don't take the little red bud, right? So we are pushing that, and that's part of the reason why, but we don't have that as an actual measure for our success. Now sustainability does. So they've been working with Hopkins and MICA, which is a local arts college in Maryland, in Baltimore, and they created a measurement system to measure heat island, and they put in I think like 300, and they're trying to expand it to even more throughout the city in neighborhoods that we planted in. So they're targeting blocks away from the neighborhoods we planted in, and then the block over where we did plant. And so the goal is, in a long term, see what the difference is in the neighborhoods where we planted versus the neighborhoods right next door that didn't get targeted. So yeah, it's one of those things that we don't have the numbers, but our Office of Sustainability is working and recording those numbers with like the help of some researchers at Hopkins to figure out the long-term goal of that. Yeah, so it's not our goal. Well, it's not that it's not our goal. It's not our measurable, but it is a measurable within Baltimore.
I have a quick question,
Yeah.
just to specify that.
Huh?
Are you planting any evergreens?
In the parks, yes, yeah, we do not plant them as street trees, maybe in a wide median, but typically we're planting them in parks and on schools. But yeah, I think one of the slides I took out of here was some data from 2014 where I think white pines was like our 7th most planted tree in the city, and that was just because we had a couple of really large plantings where we used them as like wind barriers and things like that at schools. But yeah, we try to avoid the edges of parks as well, because people living in an urban environment, people are afraid that people are hiding behind trees. and might hurt them. So we try to put them in patches and in areas where we won't cause too much backlash from the community. But we do try to use them as much as possible, yeah. Yeah.
Is your data set, like your tree inventory, will that be available to the public for people to do their own looking at?
So the end of this month, I will be going live with the web application that will display all of the data, and you can download it from there, explore the data. And we'll have that link on the TreeBaltimore website to download data.
Do you have any connection with the DC Tree Song or something?
So actually, that's an interesting question. So I actually am the co-chair of something called the UEC, which is the Urban Ecological Collaborative, and that's basically groups like TreeBaltimore from DC up to Boston. So yeah, I'm pretty close with a bunch of people like Casey Tree and just urban foresters within the DC, just from meeting at conferences as well as that program, and that's just like a monthly call-in, kind of similar to this presentation, talking about what's working in cities, what's not working, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Are you working towards establishing contiguous habitats?
Yeah, so one of the big things that the invasive vegetation management plan is looking at is not just the removal of invasives, but also the restoration of the site into long-standing wildlife habitat for sure. And as well as whenever we plant, it's not, when you come to one of our plantings, you're not just looking at uniform lines of trees. We definitely try to create little groves, keep specific species that maybe specific wildlife would appreciate, maybe off from the middle or heavy trafficked areas kind of thing. Yeah, we definitely are keeping wildlife in consideration.
Understory plants too as well?
We don't at this point, but again, tied to the invasive management plan, we are going to be planting some understory shrub level and even herbaceous level into some of these restoration areas.
Again, ecotypes or something for that area.
Yeah, yeah.
And Anita Davis had one last question.
Sure.
I think you might have addressed this already, so I'm sorry if you had. But are you enlisting citizen scientists to collect data on trees? And if you're looking for, she's mentioning, if you're looking for annual data inputs, this might be the way to go.
So we have, again, discussed it. And we do utilize it at a smaller scale level of neighborhood to neighborhood targeting planting. So again, we are getting inventory data, but that is something that still needs to be ground truth. We need to call the utilities in. So if Davey says you could open 10 pits on this block, and then you call Miss Utility, you still have to go out there and go, oh, we can only open 4 pits on this block, but the neighborhood wanted to plant 10 trees, so now we have to find 4 or 6 more. So yeah, we're utilizing them, but more so in the notion of figuring out what work can be done versus what exists kind of thing. But yeah, it's something we're looking into always, because using citizens and volunteers should be cost beneficial. But
may I add something briefly?
Yep.
We have a mission, ISAT2, it's launching this year, and you probably will learn about it from Sabrina, but we have a citizen science program where kids will take measurements of the tree heights.
oh, excellent.
And then we're going to roll it out as an app. So maybe if any of that can help you, or if you're possibility of partnering with that,
Sure.
maybe can help with some of the
Sure.
preliminary data or whatever.
Yeah, so just what I was talking about earlier, the UEC, actually, Jess Saunders and, I'm going to forget the new lady's name from Casey Tree, just presented on citizen science and the notion of utilizing local community volunteers to do some of the measurements, like in the developed parkland areas. So it's not necessarily, say, the streets where we really need to be on top of maintenance and management, but maybe along those edges of the parkland. And one, I mean, to me, citizen science is huge in getting people engaged, right? And I think that's a huge key, especially if you're utilizing kids, like get them into the parks, get them excited, understanding why they're measuring a tree and what that importance makes. And then if we can utilize that data, double the benefit, right? So I think looking at those types of things, the edge, the level, some of the developed parklands, new tree plantings, we're definitely going to be needing people to collect. Me and Nathan can't be the only 2 people going out there and collecting hundreds of tree data sets kind of thing. Yeah, so we'll be looking at a bunch of different things like that for sure. Yeah.
thank you, everyone. We're gonna stay in this room for anyone that wants to stay on chat with Charles and Nathan. And thank you again for all the people that were online, and this was a great chat that we had here. If you want, we are gonna have the recording of the talk, so if you want it, just send me an email or an email to cmspolicy@cce.nasa.gov. We're gonna have, the next talk in February is gonna be about land restoration in Latin America, with people from World Resources Institute. So we're gonna send more information about that. So thank you again to Nathan.
Thank you for
and
having
Charles.
us.
And
Yeah, thanks.
we'll see you